So with the release of Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, we now have 10 Spider-Man films. I remember when we only had one. Scratch that. I remember when we had none. So if you clicked on this video, you read the title. You know what this is. I'm going to be ranking all 10 solo Spider-Man films. Now this list will not include either of the Venom films or the Morbius film. I just don't even want to talk about any of those films. I mean, you guys understand why. And of course, this won't include Captain America Civil War, or Avengers Infinity War, or Avengers Endgame, because even though Spider-Man's in those films, those aren't solo Spider-Man films. You guys already know this. But something to keep in mind is this isn't a worst to best list. This is simply my least favorite to most favorite Spider-Man film. This entire list is purely subjective and maybe even a bit biased. And now, let's get on with it, mate. I gotta stop doing that. Now to kick off this list, at number 10, The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Now I've been bouncing back and forth between which of the last two movies on this list I dislike a little more, and sadly, it's this one. But now the movie itself does have some really great things to offer. Spider-Man swinging in this film is probably the best swinging in any live-action film. The fluidity of it and just how he moves around is so well designed. Also, his entire arc with Gwen Stacy continues to be incredible, up until the devastating end of it. And of course, Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man, he's incredible. But all those things aside, the movie still suffers, because there are just so many different threads being pulled from all different directions, to the point where it's easy to get lost in its mess. But the main reason it's placed last is because this movie repeated so many mistakes already made in a previous Spider-Man film. You know, it feels like it all could have been prevented. Like they could have learned from that movie's mistakes, but they didn't. And that leads me to the next movie on this list. Coming in at number 9, Spider-Man 3. I know it's hard to believe that this movie isn't last, but beyond how ridiculous this movie can get throughout, how they showcase Peter putting himself and Spider-Man before everything else, and the effect that has on everyone, I think it was done pretty well. You know, I personally find that darker Peter arc a little more interesting than whatever the Amazing Spider-Man 2 had to offer. Now, one of the main mistakes, which is a mistake the Amazing Spider-Man 2 repeated, was that this movie had 3 villains, 2 of which you don't really care about. I mean, Harry Osborn's Goblin, let's be honest, we don't really care about him in either film. And in this film, Venom himself didn't even appear until about an hour and 45 into the movie, like right before the final act. It was almost the same way Rhino was wasted in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. You know, both of these movies could have been more focused and grounded had they not bitten way more than they can chew. But I can sort of forgive Spider-Man 3's mistakes because it was the first time these mistakes were ever made. Coming in at number 8, Spider-Man Far From Home. It's weird ranking a movie I really like so low on the list. But nonetheless, this movie's still really fun for me. You know, I don't necessarily love that most of this movie takes place outside of New York, but it's still really easy to look past that. And I do really like how Peter's motive in this movie is so simple, yet ties into something so important for Spider-Man. Essentially, Peter can't both be Spider-Man and have a normal life. It can just never work. And this was the first time this version of Peter really faces that. And I felt the movie did a pretty good job at showcasing that. That's honestly what I like the most about this movie. But now the movie is nowhere near perfect. I would have changed so many things about it, especially when it comes to Mysterio. But at the same time, I feel like this movie did exactly what it intended to do. And everything down to the very end did pay off. I mean, this movie really did set up No Way Home pretty perfectly. Coming in at number 7, The Amazing Spider-Man. Now, I'm not that crazy about how Peter Parker was written in this movie, but it's still easy to look past that. And this movie, out of the 2 Amazing Spider-Man films, feels much more focused and well put together. The vision of this movie seemed much more clear, and the result felt much more cohesive. Also, this movie has one of my absolute favorite moments of any Spider-Man film. But it's really what the moment itself represents that's so incredible for me. See, when Peter Parker first starts going out as a vigilante, so to speak, he's doing so with the sole purpose of finding Uncle Ben's killer. That's it. That's his entire motive. Even after he's already suited up as Spider-Man. It's not until the lizard goes crazy on that bridge and Spider-Man has to come in and save people, which leads him to saving that little boy. So he saves the little boy, returns him to his father, and the boy's father asks him, "Who are you?" And Peter responds, "Spider-Man." It's such a turning point for him, because it's at that very moment that Peter realizes he can do so much more with what he has. He can do so much more with these powers. And he can be so much more than just someone seeking out revenge. He can be a hero. And that's probably one of the biggest defining moments in Spider-Man's arc. This movie just nailed it perfectly. Coming in at number 6, Spider-Man. Now you can absolutely blame my love for this movie on nostalgia all you want, but I remember seeing the trailer to this movie for the very first time, and little 7-year-old Gigi was mind blown. I could not believe what I was seeing. And still, all these years later, this movie still holds up pretty well. On its own, it's such a solid Spider-Man film. And it definitely feels like an early 2000s film. Like it's cheesy and whimsical, but in the best way. And Tobey really embodied that nerdy, kind of dorky Peter Parker really well. Also, that final fight with the Green Goblin is so much more brutal than it gets credit for. Green Goblin beats the living lights out of Spider-Man. Like, it's insane. Nostalgic or not, this movie has so many things to offer, and damn near all of them are solid. Coming in at number 5, Spider-Man Homecoming. As far as grounded and personal goes, I don't know if any other Spider-Man film did that better. And this one is simple for me. It's a straightforward movie with a straightforward plot, and whatever other elements it has to offer really shine because of how straightforward this movie is in general. Tom Holland's Spider-Man feels exactly like what a 15-year-old Spider-Man should be. Tony Stark's inclusion also works really well, because it's through Tony Stark that we get this Spider-Man anyway. His inclusion kind of feels like a reminder of that. Also, Michael Keaton as the Vulture is absolutely one of the best villains in the MCU. Who would have thought that the Vulture would be included in the same conversation as Thanos when discussing great villains in the MCU? Coming in at number 4, Spider-Man No Way Home.
What?
This movie isn't number 1?
Oh my god.
How is that possible? I mean, yeah, because deny it all you want, but had Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield and all the returning villains not been included in this film, most of you wouldn't love this movie as much as you do anyway. Which on one hand, I get it. The multiverse is opened. It makes sense for something like this to happen. And all of this did give us some really great reasons to love this movie. And there's nothing wrong with that. But is this movie great because of all of those things it did? Or is this movie great because it's just a great film? I mean, I could elaborate on that, but really it's just something to think about. Now, that being said, number 4 is still pretty high on the list. And I absolutely do love this movie. Because apart from the obvious reasons we all love this movie, this is still an incredible chapter for this version of Peter Parker. He finally feels like he's growing up and becoming the Spider-Man we all know and love. This movie marks some really pivotal moments for Peter Parker. And I think I'm more excited to see Tom Holland's Spider-Man now in whatever he appears in next than I was even when Captain America Civil War was first released. Now, coming in at number 3, Spider-Man 2. Now bear with me on this one. This was my number 1 favorite Spider-Man film for 14 years straight. The love that I have for this movie is probably the reason why this isn't a worst to best list, just a least to most favorite. And it's because I'm aware that there are other movies on this list that you could argue are better than this one. But like I said, this movie was my absolute favorite for 14 years straight. From Peter's personal arc to balancing his life being Spider-Man, his relationship with MJ being completely up in the air, the kind of shaky relationship he has with Harry Osborn now, everything about Alfred Molina as Doc Ock, and just how all around solid this movie is for me. I find damn near nothing wrong with this movie every time I watch it. I mean, I'm just a big fan of it. It's that simple. I'm not here to convince anybody that this movie is great. I'm just here to tell you why I think it is. Now, coming in at number 2, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I'm always blown away by the amount of people who initially slept on this movie, and honestly how many are still sleeping on the Spider-Verse films, simply because they're animated. But it's crazy how this movie turned out to be the best Spider-Man movie ever made. The story itself is so rich and intriguing. Then top it off with some seriously revolutionary animation, and there truly is nothing else like it. On top of the incredible story it has, it's just topped off with some really fun and entertaining characters, some really incredible action sequences. The pacing, the humor, even the drama just hits the nail so perfectly. This movie offers absolutely everything you could ever want from a Spider-Man film, and more. And I think a lot of the impact this movie made has to do with people really not knowing what to expect when they first watched it. I mean, it was easy to be weary and have doubts about it. But then everyone watches it and it just blows everyone's mind. Honestly, though, what a perfect film. Now, coming in at number one, my favorite Spider Man film, Spider Man Across the Spider-Verse. As absolutely perfect as Spider Man Into the Spider-Verse was, I can't deny that the fear going into this movie was almost as much as my excitement. Because I was kind of terrified that this movie wouldn't live up to its predecessor. Now I just reviewed this movie, so I'm going to try to keep it a bit brief. Every single thing perfect and incredible about Into the Spider-Verse is even more perfect and incredible in Across the Spider-Verse. This movie took everything that made the previous movie amazing and just cranked it up to 11. Now, if you want to know my exact thoughts on this movie, just check out my review. I'll post a link down below. But I will say here, if Into the Spider-Verse is the best Spider-Man movie ever made, Across the Spider-Verse is the very best of the best. And I know I said this isn't a worst to best list. My favorite also happens to be what I feel is the best. And this overall story isn't even finished yet. This movie ends halfway through the entire story, and I still feel this way. I still feel it's the best Spider-Man movie ever made. So there you have it, my entire ranking of every solo Spider-Man film. How would you rank these movies? Let me know down below. As always, your time is appreciated, and I'll catch you on the next one.